We've been gone a long time. We back now.
You twins?
Nah, we cousins.
Josh, give me your general feelings on the movie, as well as kind of like the reception to it and kind of like how it's been stewing in your head in the last couple weeks.
Yeah, so Ryan Coogler back, saving cinema. So, not to oversell this thing, but I feel like it's been a while since we've had a movie that is A, relatively original, B, really, really good, and C, that it's hitting pop culture in a way that it feels like we don't really see that often anymore. Everybody is so sort of segmented with their entertainment choices that, you could have like memes and in-jokes for movies and TV shows that you've never even heard of,
Yeah.
And so to have everybody making the same, jokes about, Irish jigs and,
spitting in Michael B. Jordan's mouth.
Right. Yeah. I was going to say Haley Steinfeld being freaky, it's refreshing, and it's, especially in a relatively lackluster year for movies so far. I know a lot of years, get off to a rough start, but the fact that we've only had, I would say, 2 genuinely great movies, and it's almost May, I've been like, uh-oh. And so...
Yeah, I've been trying to like catch up with some stuff that I've missed, of just like, I don't know, maybe Magazine Dreams, is that really that good? And then like watching it and being like, wow, what a slog. But I agree with you. It's exciting to have something like this out in the culture, and just sort of I'm trying to think of what the last thing that would have come out that just sort of like, for lack of a better word, the normies around me have been kind of just sort of like, is that good? I really want to see that, and just sort of feeling like a general excitement and enthusiasm about a movie being out. I mean, can you think of like what would have been that for, like, I guess last year, like there were a bunch of people, like I know Deadpool and Wolverine was a big hit, but like I know last year I had people asking me like, I don't know, is Civil War that good? But that was more of a like grotesque curiosity than like this, which seems like a real enthusiasm of, well, I don't need to know like 18 issues of comic book lore.
Right.
Like, I liked Black Panther and I liked Creed and I love Michael B. Jordan, and this is, a Southern set vampire movie. But it's so easy for people just to sort of like hop on and get interested.
Yeah, I think, honestly, you may have to go back to, I mean, if we're talking like pure culture-absorbing blockbuster, maybe, Wicked, and if you go back earlier than that, Dune
true.
Part 2.
Yeah.
But, because you have stuff like, I mean, Mufasa made $1 billion, but I don't feel like anybody was talking about Mufasa.
I feel like that was a real, like, we got to get the kids out of the house sort of situation.
So yeah, and so for the fact that the last one was Wicked, and even not to dog John Chu and all the ridiculously talented people behind Wicked, but Wicked also had like 2 decades of like Broadway reputation behind it.
Yeah.
For Sinners to come out and do the kind of business it's doing just on the back of, I like this guy as a filmmaker, Ryan Coogler hasn't let me down yet, and we love Michael B. Jordan, and I think it's really hitting because it's the constant industry thing of underselling, underrating black films. I feel like if you look at box office results, they always, underestimate the power of that audience to go out and see movies where they can see themselves on screen, and it not be like a superhero, that it's a real person, we can discuss the whether vampires are real people or not, but to see characters who are actual human beings with actual problems and actual human desires, like, everybody wants that, but especially a demographic that is constantly underserved.
And I think there's something to, this is a movie, it is a popcorn movie, but it is a popcorn movie for adults.
Absolutely.
And it being funny, this coming out, like I was vacationing in Greece, and it being funny hearing the the stories about like the Minecraft movie back here at home, and then like everywhere. Josh, you have no understanding for just like that movie. That seems like that was like the only movie that was out in Greece, because it was just like that the one movie that's just like advertising was everywhere was the Minecraft movie. But then like hearing these raucous and having a little bit of like, I have zero interest in that, but you know, a bit of myself being like, well, at least we're not hiding that like this is a children's movie made for children, like with in jokes for children and stuff like that. We aren't needing to be like, when are we going to get the serious Minecraft movie that is going to deal with America's you know, collapsing economy and deal with, you know, stuff like that.
It's like
and they have like sinners come out and be like, yes, adults, here is your blockbuster that you can have, and people warmly, you know, wrapping their arms around it has been really exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I feel like one of the best things financially for Hollywood has been the idea that, like, this movie has to appeal to everyone. And you're like, yeah, that makes you money until you make your films. Yeah, I was gonna say at some point it did, you know, but like the fact that you have to water it down so much that literally 10-year-old girls and 80-year-old grandpas can all understand the movie, like that just leads to bland, generic storytelling.
Yeah,
and
it's that quote about like, if you know, I typically hear like referred to in terms of politics of like, if you're for everyone or you kind of for no one sort of
absolutely
thing.
Yeah, and so to hopefully, fingers crossed, be reaching a point where studios are realizing like, oh, we can just make a lot of different movies. Like we can say, hey, here's a Minecraft movie that is clearly for people under 14 years old and under.
Yeah.
And here is Sinners, which is for teenagers and grown-ups,
yeah.
you know, or late teens and grown-ups. Coming from the same studio, you know, as much crap as we've given Warner Brothers over the years.
Yeah.
To have them both coming from the same studio and seeing them both dominate for very different reasons, I think that's healthy. Am I a Minecraft movie guy? No. But like, yeah. I'm not gonna dog them for making it for the people who are.
Right.
Because they also made Sinners for me.
Right. There's no kind of like trying to be like, well, adults, you can enjoy. We need the Minecraft movie to also be, you know, applicable for like people like us that are going out to the movies. And I don't know. I've just been. How has this movie been sort of like stewing in your head? Because like I went and saw it like a couple days after it came out with my girlfriend, because was out of the country for the press screening. And it was a pretty packed audience. Everyone was really like raucous and rowdy. And we walked out just being like, what an exciting, thrilling time at the movies. And then in the days, weeks since seeing it, it's just, I keep finding all of these new layers to it. And it's so exciting to like have someone like Ryan Coogler, who is so obviously has interest in being kind of a populist mainstream filmmaker, but yet also has this sense of ambition to everything that he's doing, in that there's a way you can read this movie that it is, you know, an allegory about the appropriation of black music by, you know, like white executives or like white artists. This is a allegory just about like music as like a cultural concept, and the idea that like music connects our present to our past and our history, and the way that sort of music gets sort of reinterpreted and influences what comes after it in the coming years. But also like the vampire aspect of it could be like, but if you have certain talent as a music, there are people that want to sort of leech off of that talent and want to sort of like suck you dry for monetary reasons. And it's just been so fascinating that like, this is a movie that, as we said, like is a really thrilling, sexy time at the movies, that, you know, just the excitement my girlfriend and I had when we were like, and it's also a blues musical.
Right,
You know what I
exactly.
mean? Of like, they aren't even advertising that part of it, but like there is like a large stretch of this movie that really is, it's a musical. But then also like being able to just sort of like over dinner and with friends sort of talk about like, oh yeah, you can kind of read it as this or read it as that, and no one interpretation I think is right or wrong, but it's exciting that Coogler has the ambition to, even when this movie kind of like gets a little messy towards its end, I'm sort of willing to forgive it because it is offering so much sort of both visceral pleasure as well as sort of like meat on the bone for me to kind of chew on in the days and weeks after seeing it.
Yeah, it completely accomplishes the thing I complain about a lot with movies, which is I would rather see a flawed movie that like aims high but doesn't always quite get there than something that like, yeah, it technically checks all the boxes, but who cares? You know,
Yeah.
like I really like messy movies that are trying to be something, and like is Sinners perfect? No, but even the stuff that doesn't quite work is still really fascinating for the reasons it does and doesn't. And it it accomplishes that task that I talk about a lot with my students at school. It's like, a lot of the audience is just like, I want to go see a movie where Michael B. Jordan looks good and kills some vampires. And you're like, this movie is for you. But you're also like, oh, but this also could be a controversial movie where they talk about the weaponization of Christianity as like, colonizers perverting it to make everybody, the same as them, this sort of this homogenization of cultures under the umbrella of you have to adopt what your conquering country tells you to adopt. Not everybody wants to have that conversation, but it's there if you want to have it. And so I love that it can be the same movie, but like you were saying, everybody can come away with it reading something different and nobody's technically wrong.
Yeah, and it just makes me, really I just keep going back to like how much it makes me extra value Ryan Coogler. And like I've been thinking about in the days since seeing it, kind of his place in kind of, one of my, maybe as the millennial on this podcast, one of my sort of like weird fascinations has been like, who are our like current like millennial generation of filmmakers? And like how are they sort of figuring out a way to like, how are we separating who are the real kind of like auteur artists of this millennial generation in Hollywood, and how are they trying to sort of navigate and do their own work within this sort of like very corporate studio system that has kind of been dominating? And I would say like Coogler and Greta Gerwig currently are the two people that seem to have like best figured out a way of like, I could kind of, this is an original movie that is really like Ryan Coogler's blank check project, to coin a term from another podcast, but would not have come if not for him finding a way to essentially do a Rocky sequel and then to do multiple Marvel movies. I mean, I'm less into the second Black Panther movie. That's maybe an example of maybe his ambition sort of like not quite being in grasp with that movie. But,
and to be fair, he was also making that movie with two hands tied behind his back as well.
Right.
Like,
that's I remember the reception to that movie was sort of like, he did about as good of a job as he like could have done with the what he was given, but a guy who's figured out how to tell personal stories about things that he is specifically interested in,
right,
and have these franchise movies feel like they're coming from a very personal singular voice, and then now being able to leverage that into, I get to do my own original movies. And that's kind of seems to be the space, as much as I would love another original movie from Greta Gerwig, that seems to be the space that Greta Gerwig is now moving into. Of like, I remember when her Little Women was announced, it being like, do we really need that? And then being like, shut up, of being like, oh wow, she had like a very singular take on this story that she wanted to do. And then the same thing happened again with Barbie. and that becomes such a big phenomenon. And as much as I'm just sort of like, do I really want her doing a Chronicles of Narnia movie? There is like the voice in the back of my head that's like, she's proved you wrong like twice before. Like, don't hold out on her.
Yeah, not only that, like you were saying, like she's doing it in ways that it's kind of like both her and Coogler are doing it in ways that it's almost like we're aware of their talent and potential, and it's almost like we're holding them to a higher standard. Because I remember when Little Women came out, and everybody was like, really? Must we do this again? And you're like, well, the last one was 30 years ago, and we've had like 8 Batmen since then. And nobody asked that about Batman. Right. So, and so with Ryan Coogler as well, it's like, do we need another vampire movie? I know when this was announced, it was like, Ryan Coogler's first original movie is taking on vampires, and people were like, well, are vampires original? And you're like, well, vampires aren't, but the way
those people don't know how to have fun. When I heard that there's like Ryan Coogler is doing a like Southern set vampire movie where Michael B. Jordan will play twins, I was like, sign me up.
Yeah, already done, ticket bought. But I think another thing that is catching people off guard with Sinners, and one of the reasons for its success, is we live in a very asexual cinematic landscape.
I'm really glad you brought up this point.
This is a sexy, sexy movie. Like, I've seen other people be like, this, like, people don't realize how horny this movie is. And it's almost like we've, as a culture, forgotten that movies can be that. Because I think you were in the same press screening I was. There were several scenes in the film where it's not that what they're saying is like pornographic or anything, but just the fact that they were being sexual made the audience go, like, you heard gasps, like, oh my gosh.
Yeah,
and
I wasn't at that press screening, but definitely my like normal audience, people, that you can feel people kind of like lift up a little bit in their seats. And I'm glad you brought that point up, because that is something I've been thinking about in the last few years, and thinking about it a lot last year with movies like Baby Girl and Queer, even though I was less wild about that movie, or Challengers, even though that's not a movie, as I think we've coined on this podcast, like the tennis is the sex in that movie, but of like, that is a movie with a lot of like sexual energy. And there is something to kind of what you were saying about like when, it gets back to the idea of this movie of like, if you're like making something for everyone, like what sort of like niche pleasures are you sort of eroding from culture? And this idea of just sort of like, all the conversations about like how sexless are blockbusters or just sort of our mainstream American movies are in general, and that being even such a contrast to kind of like what's on TV and stuff like that. And I agree with you. I think that those reactions people are having to that is sort of this kind of like, oh, I forgot you could have this kind of, you could play with that kind of emotion that an audience can have of like, we are very sexual creatures, like deep down, and you can play with the desire, and you can play with like this very integral part to the human experience in your movie, even if it is just sort of to like elicit a little bit of just sort of like, goosebumps from your audience of like, oh, okay, are they gonna go there?